She called me to the restaurant where I proposed, then had me arrested. 5 years later, she handed me custody of our kids, and nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Hey there, and welcome to what turned out to be the most gut-wrenching chapter of my life. Yeah, this is a real story about betrayal, heartbreak, and the kind of lesson you wish you never had to learn. I found myself sitting in a quiet, too familiar conference room at my attorney's office, feeling this weird wave of déjà vu. The same framed prints hung crookedly on the beige walls, the same stiff chairs lined up against the same scratched table, and even that old, wrinkled copy of National Geographic still sat on the end table like a relic no one dared to throw away. Despite all the money I'd handed over to this place over the years, it didn't seem like they'd spent a dime updating the space. But this time I wasn't racking up any fees. I was alone. So why was I back here if I didn't even need legal help this time? Well, it all comes back to one name, Rachel Monroe. My ex-wife. For the past few weeks, she'd been trying to reach out to me, but she kept coming up empty. And that wasn't by accident. After everything she dragged me through during our divorce, I made it a point never to respond directly. I learned the hard way that even a simple reply could backfire fast. It only took one painful experience to become a believer in the system's caution. See, near the end of our divorce proceedings, Rachel had asked to meet, said she wanted to talk through custody arrangements. She suggested we meet at this cozy little restaurant we used to frequent, the same one where I'd gotten down on one knee years ago and asked her to be my wife. Looking back, I don't know why I took the bait. Maybe it was hope. Maybe stupidity. Maybe just the remnants of love, still kicking around in the corners of my heart. I put on a blazer and tie, figured maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new between us. I walked into the restaurant, heart pounding, eyes scanning the room until I spotted her in the back by the window wearing a sleek black dress. Still as striking as ever, tall, graceful, and impossible to ignore. For a moment she looked serene. Almost like she was waiting for me. I told the hostess I was joining her and made my way to the table. But as I got closer, I noticed something change. Her face went from calm to cold in a flash. I opened my mouth to say something, but I never got the chance. 2 uniformed officers suddenly appeared at my side. "Are you Matthew Cole?" one of them asked. I nodded, confused. "You're under arrest for violating a temporary restraining order." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain she was the one who called me. She asked me to come. I wasn't there to start trouble, just to talk. But it didn't matter. The law was the law, and they weren't interested in my side of the story. As they cuffed me right there in the middle of the restaurant, shame flooded every part of me. I caught the eye of a little kid at the next table. He looked terrified. I wanted to tell him I wasn't some criminal, that I was just a guy who got played by someone he used to love. But how do you explain that to a stranger, especially in a moment like that? Before I could process what was happening, I was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the weight of humiliation pressing harder than the steel around my wrists. I kept insisting to the officers that I hadn't done anything wrong, but they barely acknowledged me. I figured they'd heard it all before, every guy in cuffs claiming he was innocent. They didn't yell or rough me up, they just did their job like it was routine. After being booked and fingerprinted, I was shackled with extra restraints, then shuffled into a van with a handful of other guys. After the required head count, we were driven across town to the county courthouse. There, with our ankles still chained, we were led down into a dim basement holding cell that smelled like metal, mildew, and stale sweat. We waited, no idea how long, just sitting on hard benches, staring at the floor, listening to the shuffling feet of others being called before the judge. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the afternoon when my name echoed through the hallway. "Tyler Mason?" The bailiff called out. I stood up, stiff and exhausted, my clothes rumpled and sour-smelling from the jail cot I'd barely slept on. I hadn't shaved in days and felt like a mess standing in front of the judge. And there she was, Rachel, my ex-wife. She stood on the opposite side of the courtroom looking composed and confident, like she'd planned this all down to the minute. Her attorney wasted no time painting a picture of me as a dangerous, unstable man. He recounted Friday night like it was a scene from a thriller movie. Every word from his mouth made my stomach turn. It was like hearing someone twist your life into a script you didn't write. Rachel didn't speak. She didn't need to. The smirk on her face did enough damage. After the hearing, I was released with strict instructions. I didn't speak a word to her as I left the building. I just wanted to get back to whatever pieces of life I had left. Getting my truck back turned out to be another headache. The process was tied up in red tape and miscommunication. It took hours of waiting, signing forms, arguing with clerks. But eventually, keys in hand, I drove back to the place I now called home, a second-hand camper trailer tucked behind a long dirt driveway. The trailer wasn't much, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a tiny bathroom, a kitchenette, and just enough power to keep the lights on. I parked, stepped inside, peeled off the clothes that still reeked of jail, and tossed them in a corner. I took a minute just to sit on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of everything. That's when my phone buzzed. A message. From Rachel. It read, "Tyler, I'm so sorry about the misunderstanding." I stared at it for a moment, stunned. A misunderstanding? Is that what she was calling this? Before I could stop myself, I typed back, "Rachel, what were you trying to prove?" And then, nothing. No reply. Just silence. Later that evening, my buddy Jack from work gave me a ring. At first, I figured he'd try to talk me into letting go of the grudge or maybe convince me to give Rachel another chance, something I wasn't about to hear. But instead, he just asked how I was holding up. Eventually, I changed the subject and asked him if he knew of any local construction jobs hiring. He paused for a second, then rattled off a few names, but it was all dead ends. No one was bringing on new help right now. That hit hard. I still had bills to pay, debts lingering like storm clouds, and a lawyer who seemed to care more about my checkbook than my case. So I asked Jack if he knew anyone needing help with odd jobs, handyman work, repairs, whatever. His voice perked up at that, said he'd ask around. Later, I went out back and shared a beer with Mr. Lambert, the retired mechanic who owned the lot where I parked my camper. I'd gotten scratched up earlier fixing a patch of rust on the trailer, so I figured I'd need a tetanus shot the next day. But for now, a cold drink and some company were enough medicine for the night. Mr. Lambert extended a firm handshake and told me, "You call me Robert." We made small talk under the stars, the kind of talk that didn't require much effort, just two men keeping each other company through the quiet. I pulled out of Robert's lot slow and steady, towing the trailer behind me like it weighed 1,000 tons. My next stop was my grandparents' place, a temporary landing zone until I could figure out what came next. Tomorrow I'd take care of dumping the debris and waste I'd hauled out. But that was the easy part. Physical labor was never the problem. The real weight was what came after. Because of Rachel's claims, fabricated, twisted half-truths meant to paint me as unstable, the state's child protection agency had stepped in. I couldn't even begin to explain what that felt like. One day you're tucking your kids in at night, and the next you're being told you need a government employee present just to spend time with them. For now, my time with my daughter Ellie, 8, and my son Noah, 10, was limited to supervised visits at a neutral facility, some overly sanitized room in a downtown office building with dull paint and broken toys. But even in that space, when those two ran toward me smiling, arms wide open, it was like the rest of the world disappeared. I lived for those few hours. And then came the heartbreak every time I had to let them go. Back at home, or what passed for it, loneliness became a sort of roommate. I started staying up late, reading books in bed just to pass the time. The silence was deafening. I missed the way Rachel used to lean her head on my shoulder during late-night talks. I missed the quiet laughter we shared under the covers. Now, those moments were nothing but memories that haunted the walls of the trailer. As if that wasn't enough, Rachel had started claiming we were financially struggling, that she and the kids were going without the basics. The words blindsided me. I asked her to be specific, to tell me what exactly they lacked. She gave me nothing. Just vague accusations meant to sting. It wasn't until 6 months later that I found out what the missing piece was. His name was Travis Monroe. At first, the name didn't mean much. Just a guy. But eventually, the puzzle pieces began falling into place. He was Rachel's new friend, though they weren't exactly keeping things discreet. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The weight of it all followed me to work. I tried to focus, clock in, hammer nails, measure beams, but my thoughts wandered. Especially on Mondays when the kids had school and I couldn't be there to make them breakfast or double-check their backpacks. I went to lunch with the guys from the crew but couldn't stomach a bite. Just pushed food around the plate, pretending to be okay. That afternoon, as I was packing up at the job site, a man walked up to me. Clean shirt, official tone, thick envelope in hand. "You've been served," he said. Just like that, it was all real. I opened the packet right there by the side of the truck. Legal paperwork, cold and clinical, with words like divorce, alimony, and restraining order jumping off the page like threats. My hands shook as I read. I called a friend from the crew, Dan, someone who'd been through this kind of storm before. He didn't talk much, just listened. And then he gave me a number for a decent lawyer and said, "You'll need it." I started pulling together whatever assets I had. Made a list of everything I owned. It was a short list. The judge decided I could only see my kids under supervision until everything was settled. That crushed me more than anything else. I'd planned to rent a small apartment during the divorce, someplace close to the kids, but the numbers didn't add up. Legal fees were piling high and fast. That's when another buddy at work, Greg, offered me an old trailer he had parked behind his shed, $300 cash. I took it, moved it into the cheapest trailer park I could find. The kind of place where the streetlights flicker and the neighbors stay behind closed doors. But it was mine. It was a roof. And it was survival. Then one afternoon, like she hadn't already done enough damage, Rachel called and asked if I wanted to meet up to talk. She said maybe we could work things out. Maybe even start over. Against all logic, I agreed. A small part of me, deep down, still wanted to believe there was something worth salvaging. We waited. I brought the kids with me thinking this might be a new beginning. But 35 minutes passed. She still hadn't shown. The kids were getting anxious. A woman from the office leaned in and whispered, "Maybe you should call her, see what's going on." I told her, "They're probably just running late." Even then, I was still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. I tried to explain to the social worker that calling Rachel wasn't a good idea, that this meeting was important, that it wasn't just about checking a box, it was about holding on to what little connection I had left with my kids. But she called anyway. Rachel picked up and casually said they had miscalculated the time. Said they'd ended up at the zoo in Dallas instead. Like it was a simple oversight. She told the social worker it wouldn't happen again, and the social worker nodded, offering one of those tight-lipped smiles that hides frustration. I could see she was packing up to leave, sliding her notepad into her worn leather bag. "Please," I said. "We still have 20 minutes. Can't we wait?" She looked at me with a kind of tired pity, the kind people save for stray dogs. She didn't say no. But she didn't stay either. I sat there alone in that sterile room, wondering what kind of father gets stood up by his own kids, and still waits, hoping they'll walk through the door. A few days later I finally did see them. Ellie and Noah. It was quiet in the room. Too quiet. I tried to talk to them, to joke, to bring up old games or their favorite snacks. Nothing landed. The silence stretched until Ellie finally said something that cut me in half. "It's not like you're really our dad anymore." I should have exploded. I should have flipped that table and yelled until the walls shook. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at her like I didn't recognize the person speaking. I turned to Noah. "Is that how you feel too? Are you tired of me visiting?" He didn't say a word. Just dropped his head and gave the smallest nod. I felt something inside me collapse. Like a final, quiet folding in on itself. I took a breath, then asked the hardest question I've ever had to say out loud. "Do you two want to stop the visits?" Neither of them answered with words. Just those same nods, eyes glued to the floor. "Okay," I said. That was it. Just, okay. It didn't feel real. I walked out of the building like a ghost. Just going through the motions until I ended up back in the trailer, back in my head, back in the version of life where everything was unraveling and I didn't have the strength to tie it back together. Later that week I found myself back at Robert's. We were reviewing topographical maps and inputting coordinates into his old laptop. His granddaughter, Gail, was working quietly at the table. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, big reading glasses perched on her nose. No makeup, pale skin, a serious, almost severe look. But still, there was something striking about her. She was tall, taller than most women I'd met, and for a second I caught myself wondering what it would be like to look into those intense, ice-blue eyes and not feel judged. I shook the thought off. This wasn't the time for that. We were digging through history, literally. The Red River once carried ancient trees buried for centuries. They would float downriver and pile up into what became known as the Great Raft, a log jam so dense, it ran over 150 miles upstream. You could walk across it for miles and not see a drop of water. Most of those trees eventually sank. Heavy, waterlogged, forgotten. Until Captain Shreve was tasked with clearing the way to make the river navigable again. And now, somehow, I was part of a team trying to see if we could dredge some of that old timber up and turn it into something useful. The hope was, if we could prove the venture feasible, Robert could sell the timber and break even on the equipment. Me. I was hoping for a paycheck. Something steady. Something I could rely on. After the meeting wrapped, I headed for the door. Gail followed me out onto the porch. "Mr. Mason," she called. I turned around. She was standing at the top of the steps, arms crossed, eyes locked on mine with a mix of challenge and warning. "I'm not exactly thrilled about you being our partner in this," she said. "From where I'm standing, it feels like we're just giving away money." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong to be skeptical. "This deal only works," she added, "if we can actually pull enough timber to turn a profit. Otherwise we sell the equipment and cut our losses. But for you, you'll be out a day's pay. For us, it could mean much more." I nodded slowly. Understood. Truth was, my finances were already circling the drain. Another day of work lost might not seem like much to her, but to me, it felt like I was losing another piece of the little I had left. At that point in my life, I was clinging hard to any sliver of hope, and this logging venture felt like the only thing keeping me afloat. I needed it to work, not just for money but for something to believe in. Something to throw myself into that wasn't connected to lawyers, courtrooms, or aching silence in supervised visitation rooms. After reviewing our options with Gail, Robert decided we'd start small, targeting a lesser-known tributary where we could operate discreetly. Less visibility, fewer questions, and time to work out the kinks before expanding. I was a little surprised when Gail decided to come along for the first outing. She didn't say much, just showed up at the launch point with a clipboard, her GPS device, and that same guarded look she always wore. We loaded the dredging equipment into the boat in silence, tension hanging just under the surface like the logs we were hunting. To our surprise, that first day went far better than expected. Within hours, we dredged up a cypress log, a good one. Cypress is prized, and this one looked clean, solid, straight. We kept going, and by late afternoon, we had 5 cypress trees floating at the surface, tagged and ready for harvest. Back on shore, Robert and I exchanged a few quiet fist bumps and handshakes, the kind of restrained celebration older men allow themselves. Gail stood beside me for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, there was a truce in the making. But as quickly as the moment appeared, it passed, and she drifted back to her gear. We hauled the logs to the yard and secured a meeting with a lumber buyer the next morning. Gail handled the negotiation. I'll give her this, when it came to business she was sharp, calm and relentless. She reminded the buyer that prices were climbing due to limited supply, then coolly pointed out that our logs offered superior volume and quality, higher board feet, better grain, cleaner ends. The buyer tried to lowball us, of course, but Gail wasn't having it. She stayed firm, and after some back and forth, he finally offered a number that made both Robert and me glance at each other, eyebrows raised. A deal was struck. The check would be mailed and a pickup scheduled for the second haul. I should have felt proud. And I did, for a moment. But that high faded fast. Saturday was wasted waiting for another buyer who never showed. I ended up unloading a full trailer late in the day, exhausted but too restless to stop. I prepped 3 more hauls for Sunday, hoping the work would keep my mind off Ellie and Noah. It mostly did. But every so often I'd think of them, my kids, still out there, probably being told a version of me that wasn't real. Oddly enough, I didn't feel much toward Rachel anymore. Not anger. Not longing. Just nothing. Whatever fire she'd sparked in me had burned out, leaving only ash. But Gail? That was different. By the time the first leaves started falling, her resistance to me had only grown colder. Her tone sharpened, her comments more clipped. The weather didn't help. Early freezes forced us to take more breaks just to thaw our hands before diving. I signed up for a refresher scuba course and tried to line up a proper dive partner. One of the first rules I'd learned in my training years ago: never dive alone. But when I watched Gail plotting coordinates into the GPS with that same meticulous intensity, I had a gut feeling she didn't expect me to be the one pulling logs come spring. If I had to guess, I'd say she was laying the groundwork to push me out of the project. Convince Robert to bring in someone cheaper, more efficient. Maybe a full-time crew that didn't ask questions. The thought of being edged out again, just when something finally felt stable, boiled in me. I turned away to avoid eye contact with her as the sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows over the water. That day ended with a bad dive. The riverbed dropped off sharply and we lost footing on the sandbar. I slipped under with barely enough breath to think. Gail tried to help, but we both ended up tangled, half-submerged, soaked and shaking. By the time we scrambled up the bank, numb from head to toe, I was dragging myself through thick, wet sand, desperate just to stay warm. My hands clawed at the pine straw and scattered leaves, trying to gather enough to start a fire. We didn't speak much. But for a few brief minutes as we sat there trying to dry off, steam rising from our soaked clothes, something passed between us that felt different. Not friendship. Not trust. But maybe, just maybe, recognition. That we were both stuck here. Trying to salvage something in a world that kept taking more than it gave. I cupped my hands around the fire starter materials, trying to shield them from the biting wind. My Zippo lighter slipped once, twice in my cold fingers. I was shaking hard now, hypothermia creeping in, dulling my senses and slowing my reaction time. I flicked the wheel with my thumb, muttering a quiet prayer that the flame would catch. It finally sparked to life, flickering weakly against the gusts. I held it close to the small nest of pine straw and twigs, coaxing it like a wounded animal. For a second, I didn't even breathe, just watched until the flame took hold and began to grow, licking the dry wood and crackling to life. Gail, soaked and silent, stood nearby watching. Then she quietly excused herself and said she'd head farther into the woods to gather more firewood. I understood what she meant without explanation. It was her way of asking for privacy while she changed out of her wet clothes. I nodded and turned away, respecting her space. I waited near the tree line for as long as I could manage, the cold gnawing at me even from a distance. When I finally returned to the fire, my body stiff and aching, I saw something that caught me off guard. My own clothes were laid out beside the fire, drying alongside hers. She hadn't said anything. Just, "Done it?" "Thanks," I said softly. She nodded, not meeting my eyes. We were both doing our best to act like this was all routine, two professionals just managing a situation. But if someone had stumbled upon us huddled around a sputtering fire, avoiding eye contact like shy teenagers, they might have laughed. Two grown adults, freezing to the bone, and still too awkward to look each other in the face. Time lost meaning in the cold. My teeth wouldn't stop chattering, and the fire, though warm, felt like it would never be enough. At some point, I realized the river's current had dragged the boat far down the shoreline. I didn't know how far, maybe a mile, maybe 5. But I couldn't leave her stranded here, not without a way back. That thought alone gave me the push I needed. I forced myself to my feet, limbs heavy and fingers numb, and started down the bank. I stumbled a few times, boots sliding in the wet sand, vision blurring from exhaustion. Eventually, I crested a rise and spotted the silhouette of the boat bobbing gently in the water like a ghost waiting for me. I took a breath, bracing myself for what came next. No one told me I had to. No one forced me to. But I leapt into the water again, the cold slicing through me like knives. My breath caught in my throat as I powered through, reached the boat, and pulled myself aboard. By the time I made it back, Gail had kept the fire going strong. My clothes were warm now, steaming slightly, even smoking a little from the heat. She adjusted them carefully to keep them from burning, then sat back down on the opposite side of the fire. We didn't talk. We just sat, the fire between us, thawing slowly. And for a moment I caught myself thinking, maybe I could get used to this. The silence, the simplicity, the unspoken rhythm of survival and shared effort. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. But it wasn't loneliness either. Eventually she stood. "Your clothes should be dry now," she said. "I'll give you a moment." She disappeared into the woods again, giving me space. I dressed, grateful to be warm again, and started the boat's engine. As if on cue, Gail reappeared at the tree line. Together we packed up what we could, and I asked her to help me douse the fire with sand. She didn't argue, just nodded and joined in. Later that night, back at Robert's place, I stood near the fireplace while the flames danced around thick pieces of seasoned oak. I'd used some of the dry tinder he kept in a small wooden box, and the room was finally warm again. I was drying off when Gail stepped out from the kitchen carrying 2 large ceramic mugs, both steaming. "I'm afraid this is the best I can offer, straight from the can," she said, handing me one of the mugs with a small smile. "But next time, I promise it'll be homemade." I took the soup with a quiet nod, grateful beyond words. She disappeared again, returning with 2 thick wool blankets from the closet. Without saying anything else, she tossed one to me and curled up with the other on the couch, close but not too close. It was the first time the silence between us didn't feel heavy. For once it felt restful. What happened to me that night is still something I struggle to wrap my head around. I woke up in a hospital room, groggy and confused, with no clear memory of how I got there. The nurse told me I'd been found unconscious and brought in by emergency responders. A toxicology screen revealed I'd been drugged, Rohypnol, they said. The kind of drug people use to take away someone's ability to fight back. I didn't believe it at first. Thought maybe they had the wrong chart. But then came the part one never expected. They'd performed a forensic exam. A rape kit. There were signs of assault. They collected DNA evidence and sent it to the lab. The test would take time. Meanwhile, they started me on a series of medications. Some preventative, some precautionary. I'm still on a few of them, going in for checkups regularly, trying to make sense of a body that no longer feels entirely like mine. A detective was assigned to my case. She was calm and direct. Told me I'd done the right thing by coming in. But every word she said felt like it belonged in someone else's life, not mine. That night, back on the riverbank with Gail, when we were freezing trying to survive, I had a moment where panic clawed its way up my spine. She told me to take off my clothes so they could dry, but my mind twisted it. For a few seconds, I wasn't on a riverbank anymore. I was trapped, vulnerable, and certain that the worst was about to repeat itself. I sat there frozen, convinced that I was seconds away from being hurt again. But she didn't come at me. She didn't touch me. She just built the fire, sat beside it, warmed her hands. And slowly I began to understand that she wasn't who I feared. She wasn't the monster from my past. I felt a wave of shame rise up inside me, for all the things I'd projected onto her. I couldn't hold it in. I started crying, silently at first, then harder. She noticed. She came over, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat beside me. Quiet. Steady. Not to fix it, just to be there. The next day we made a plan. We drove to College Station and went straight to the police. Gail walked into that station with her shoulders squared and gave a full statement. Named the man who hurt her. Her voice didn't waver. Later we met her roommates. When she told them everything, they didn't hesitate. They embraced her. Then they hugged me too. The warmth of it broke something loose in me. I'd been holding so much tension for so long, I didn't know how to accept tenderness anymore. That night I needed painkillers, not for my body but for my heart. It was a strange kind of pain, one born from the kindness I hadn't expected. In the days that followed, Gail asked if we could go back, to that same sandbar. The place where everything had changed. I understood why, so I said yes. We packed the truck with everything we'd need. I set up the site like before, fire pit, tent, air mattress. I brought a simple meal, hot dogs, marshmallows, bottled water, a couple of sodas, and one cold bottle of champagne tucked into the cooler like a promise we weren't quite ready to name. The evening was different this time. Light-hearted. We laughed more. Talked more. There was a calmness between us that hadn't existed before, like a quiet trust had finally settled in. At one point as we sat near the fire, Gail turned to me, her hand finding my face. There was no rush in her movements. No pressure. Just presence. She said something soft, something about wanting to meet me where I was. That I didn't need to ask for anything. She already knew. After we ate, we walked into the water, hand in hand, the surface still and quiet around us. We bathed slowly, carefully, in silence, like we were washing away everything we didn't need to carry anymore. As the sun came up and the fog began to lift, we got dressed again. Packed up the gear, folded the tent, deflated the mattress we hadn't even used. There was a peace in the routine of it. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe, not all at once, but maybe I was going to be okay. I found myself thinking about planning another trip soon. Something peaceful. Something to hold on to, now that the dust was finally starting to settle. On the drive back home, though, that calm was pierced by what I'd recently learned about my kids. Stephen, now 15, had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Skipping school. Picking fights. Hanging around older boys who saw trouble as something to brag about. And Carol, only 13, was seeing someone far older than she had any business even knowing. That knowledge settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. These weren't the same bright-eyed kids I used to walk to the park and read bedtime stories to. Somewhere along the way they had drifted off course. And I wasn't there to steer them back. Then out of nowhere came a call from Rachel. After 5 years with barely a word, she wanted to transfer full custody to me. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe it was a trick, another setup. But then she told me, she was pregnant. Her tone held no joy, only exhaustion. She didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I didn't feel victorious, just stunned. This wasn't how I imagined being reunited with my kids. There was no dramatic court scene. Just a phone call and a hollow voice on the other end, passing the torch because she couldn't carry it anymore. I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't going to be easy. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding our family, this was going to take time. As the sun dipped low that evening, Stephen asked where they'd be staying. I told him I'd purchased the old Andrews property, and Gail was helping prepare the rooms. He didn't say much. Just looked out the window, arms crossed. I knew it would take more than a roof and beds to win them back. When we pulled into the driveway, I explained to both of them that they'd be meeting Gail's grandfather, Robert Lambert. He was my business partner, and a good man. Stephen still had that chip on his shoulder, but I saw a flicker of curiosity. Later, over dinner, I tried to talk to them about school. Their grades. The lessons they'd be catching up on. I mentioned I'd joined the PTA to stay involved. Stephen rolled his eyes, barely hiding his irritation. When I asked if he wanted to help me with an old project car out in the garage, he shut me down immediately. Said he wasn't interested. That night, I brought it up to Gail. She nodded and told me she had an idea, a quiet confidence in her voice. She didn't go into detail, but I could tell she was thinking it through. I just hoped her plan would reach him in a way I couldn't. Little by little we started making progress. It came in small wins, Carol helping with groceries, Stephen cracking a joke at the dinner table. One major hurdle came when I finally sat Carol down and asked her to reconsider the relationship she was in. She pushed back hard. Things were tense. Then one afternoon her boyfriend showed up at our front door. With a duffel bag and a wild plan. He said he was going to run away with her. Carol stepped into the hallway holding a suitcase. My heart sank. I told him to leave. Told him if he ever contacted her again before she turned 18, I'd involve the police. She protested, said I couldn't stop her. But Stephen stepped forward. He put a hand on her shoulder and looked her in the eye. Said, "This isn't the way, Carol. You'll regret it. You know it." Something in his voice cut through the noise. And for once she listened. That night I woke to shouting. I rushed out of bed to find Carol's boyfriend had come back and was attacking Stephen. I pulled him off, called the police and pressed charges. It was a nightmare, but in some strange way it was also a turning point. Because the next morning, Carol didn't just apologize. She hugged Stephen. Tight. And didn't let go. We all sat together that afternoon, me, Carol, and Stephen. I told them I couldn't undo the past. But the future? That was ours if we wanted it. We hugged. And in that hug, something shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The next evening, we all gathered for Stephen and his friend Betty's high school graduation. Gail was there sitting beside me. Carol next to her. Robert came too, along with my grandparents. We filled a whole row. And when Stephen walked across that stage, tassel swinging, and shook the principal's hand, I felt a quiet kind of pride I hadn't known in years. He'd made it. We had made it. As the sun set behind the bleachers and the crowd erupted in cheers, I looked around at the people beside me. People who, in some way or another, had become family. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. Thanks for following my story. If you've been through something like this or just need a place to be heard, drop a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if you connected with any of this, feel free to share it. Sometimes, the right story at the right time makes all the difference.